Gen Z has it easy. Your 10-year-old cousin pipes up over the dinner table, barely looking up from an iPad displaying a Minecraft video split-screened with rapid-fire Subway Surfers gameplay. You shove another spoonful of mashed potatoes in your mouth before you can say, "At least my brain wasn't fundamentally rewired by an algorithm before I learned to walk," and kick off another Gen Z versus Gen Alpha battle on family night. But is it all in the eye of the beholder, or does one generation really have it rougher right now? Find out on this episode of the Infographics Show. Gen Z versus Generation Alpha. Which is worse to be in 2026? Every generation thinks the next is ruining everything they built, but it's usually just a case of social change. Parents moan, kids rebel, and life goes on. But with skyrocketing screen times, a rapidly shifting education system, and a future heavily threatened by climate anxiety and artificial intelligence, those generational tensions aren't just awkward, they're boiling over. Many of the older Zoomers feel like they're entering a brutal economy that doesn't work for them, while the youngest alphas are growing up in a digitized world that is accelerating way too fast. And as things get tougher, even the younger generations are starting to spar more. It's kids versus kids. Wait, Gen Z is how old? That can't be right. Gen Z is the generation that started in 1997 and continued until 2012. The oldest of them are now approaching their late 20s, entering their prime career years and trying to navigate an impossible housing market. They grew up in an age of technological transition. They remember a time before iPads, when YouTube didn't have double ads, and social media was just for connecting with school friends. But their early adulthood and high school years were completely upended by the COVID-19 pandemic. They missed out on critical milestones, had to adjust to remote classrooms overnight, and graduated into a hyperinflated economy where entry-level jobs are harder to find than ever. And that was the world the next generation was coming up in. Gen Alpha never knew the pre-smartphone world. Born between 2013 and 2024, they are the first generation to be born entirely in the 21st century. They were literally babysat by algorithms from infancy. They didn't have to adjust to a digital world, they were born into it. For many of them, their earliest memories of preschool or kindergarten were on a Zoom screen. They've grown up in a fully post-pandemic landscape dominated by short-form video content, smart assistants, and generative AI. And if you ask the older generation, it's left both cohorts in a bit of a mess. The disputes between Gen Z and Gen Alpha are mostly online and petty. Gen Z would like Gen Alpha to put down the $5 Stanley Cups and step away from the Sephora counter, and Gen Alpha thinks Gen Z's middle parts and obsession with early 2000s nostalgia is incredibly cringe. But there's one key difference between these two generations and past generational scraps. Gen Z typically aren't the parents of Gen Alpha. That honor belongs mostly to millennials. However, there is enough of a gap that older Zoomers are starting to look at their younger Alpha siblings and cousins with absolute bewilderment. And both groups are finding themselves competing for attention in a digital space that is getting awfully crowded. One of the biggest challenges Gen Z faces is finding steady, full-time work in an era dominated by freelance gig work and AI integration. This has led to an increase in hustle culture, as young people try to make ends meet while battling employers who are notoriously hesitant to hire them. Many companies complain that Gen Z employees lack corporate loyalty and struggle with traditional office communication. But for Gen Alpha, the future of work is an even bigger question mark. By the time they enter the job market, generative AI will likely have automated many of the entry-level writing, coding, and creative jobs that Gen Z is currently fighting over. This generation might have to reinvent the very definition of a career before they even graduate high school. And the older generations are saying, "Hey, it's not us, it's you." In school and early classrooms, teachers are sounding the alarm on Gen Alpha. They are reporting a massive literacy and attention span crisis. Because Gen Alpha's brains have been stimulated by constant hyper-dopamine short-form video algorithms since toddlers, traditional reading and writing assignments are failing to keep them engaged. A growing plurality of educators note that many alphas are struggling to read at grade level, to which Gen Alpha responds by watching a video at double speed while playing Roblox on their phones.
By contrast, Gen Z is much more literate, having grown up during the golden age of YA dystopian novels and internet forums. They know technology well, but aren't entirely dependent on it to function in a physical space. They can get along with physical books, even if they prefer to buy them because of a recommendation on Book Talk. But the problem is, it may not matter. Gen Z has a much stronger footing when it comes to basic academic skills, but in terms of entering a digital economy, Gen Alpha is so technologically fluent that they might bypass traditional learning altogether, utilizing AI tools to write their essays and code their games before they hit middle school. However, unless they bring up their real-world attention span, holding down a traditional job in the future might be a massive hurdle. But classroom results are just part of the picture. What about the money? Gen Z typically does have more money in the bank than Gen Alpha. At least we should hope so, considering Gen Alpha's oldest members are only just entering their teens. But when you look at progression, it's a very thorny topic. Gen Z is facing an unprecedented cost of living crisis. Everything from basic groceries to car insurance has skyrocketed, leaving many young adults with high levels of credit card debt. In fact, cashless and contactless mobile payments have made spending so seamless that many Gen Zers treat their bank accounts less as a hard limit and more as a light suggestion. But for Gen Alpha, consumerism has reached a new bizarre level. Despite being children, they are driving massive refill trends. They are notoriously cost unaware, obsessing over high-end skincare brands like Drunken Elephant and collecting massive cups as status symbols. Because their social circles exist largely in virtual spaces like Roblox and Fortnite, they are spending actual currency on digital cosmetics, essentially paying real money for virtual clothes. And that leads to the next big stumbling block: housing and lifestyle. For Gen Z, home ownership feels like a pipe dream. Many are stuck renting indefinitely or living with their parents well into their 20s to save money. The rise of private equity buying up starter homes has caused prices to skyrocket, making the traditional American dream feel completely out of reach. But for Gen Alpha, is the story going to be any different? They are growing up in a world where the concept of ownership is fading entirely, replaced by subscription models for everything from entertainment to software and potentially even housing. And first comes the house, and then comes the relationship. One of the key distinctions of Gen Z is that they are dating less and marrying much later than previous generations. The ease of online interaction and the economic strain of building a life has caused many to put romance on the back burner. Does the pattern follow for Gen Alpha? It's too early to tell, but early indicators show that Gen Alpha is even more socially isolated. Because so much of their childhood has been mediated through screens, real-world socialization is declining. Gen Alpha is the first generation to grow up with AI companions, leading some sociologists to wonder if they will form relationships with algorithms rather than actual humans. And what about children? Gen Z is already expressing a historic lack of interest in starting families. Polls show that nearly a third of young adults do not plan on ever having children, citing financial instability and deep-seated climate anxiety. And Gen Alpha may take this trend and double down on it. Growing up with constant, catastrophic news cycles about global warming and political unrest delivered directly to their feeds daily, their outlook on the future of the planet is incredibly bleak. Many ask if it's even ethical to bring new life into a world that feels like it's on life support. Which means that in many ways, the kids are not all right. It might seem like mental health is a much bigger crisis for Gen Z. They are highly vocal about anxiety, depression, and therapy. But for Gen Alpha, the crisis is manifesting differently. Psychologists are warning of iPad brain and extreme sensory overload. Being babysat by hyper-stimulating, algorithmically curated videos has led to skyrocketing rates of ADHD diagnoses and behavioral issues in classrooms. And that kind of anxiety doesn't just take a toll on the mind, it takes a toll on the body. While Gen Z has made healthy strides, smoking and drinking rates are at historic lows compared to millennials and boomers, they have a massive vaping problem. Gen Alpha, on the other hand, is showing trends of being incredibly sedentary. Because virtual spaces are their primary playground, physical exercise rates among Gen Alpha have dropped significantly, putting them at higher risk for childhood obesity and screen-induced eye strain. However, they are also obsessed with physical wellness culture at an incredibly young age, drinking specialized hydration drinks and slathering on expensive serums before they've even hit puberty. It's a strange paradox of being physically inactive while hyperfixated on aesthetic health. And if it seems like this paints a confusing picture of who has it worse, you're right. If you ask most people, they would probably say Gen Alpha has the potential for a smoother ride technologically, since they will be perfectly equipped for a future dominated by AI and virtual reality. But Gen Z has the distinct advantage of remembering what the world felt like before it was completely simulated. They have a foundation of real-world social skills and offline memories that Gen Alpha may never truly experience. So who's really got it worse in 2026? Would you swap generations? Let us know in the comments. Want to know more about the generational structures that have defined the last century and why they always seem to be yelling at each other? Check out Every Generation Explained in 10 minutes, or watch this video instead.